What I'm going to talk about is reading Tyndale in its original form. And some of you will be familiar with looking at how it was presented originally, and some of you weren't. So I've got illustrations, and I'm going to try now share a PowerPoint. So what this came about is I started a project to create authentic transcriptions of Tyndale, and the idea that those will be available to scholars and in websites and online. And in doing so, I faced this ancient text and I had to work out what was going on. So really, what I'm going to tell you is what I've learned. There will be people on this call who've done similar things that can also chip in, feel free. Uh, but my little introduction is just to say that for a lot of people, William Tyndale's original texts look hard. And that's because of the font and the typography and the orthography. But once you get past these, Tyndale is quite easy to read and actually surprisingly modern. And I'm going to illustrate this with photos that I took during our Antwerp conference. So there you can see the front cover of Tyndale's 1526 New Testament. So the things I'm going to cover are font and letters, spellings and punctuation, archaic language, numbers, and extra features. And by the end, we'll have a look at a bit of a text, and you should just be able to read it if you can't already. When we were in the Antwerp conference, we had the pleasure of attending the Mauritshuis Plantin Print Museum, where they've got original Tudor printing presses. Now, we don't believe these are the actual ones that were used for Tyndale's New Testament, although they might have been. But this is what they look like. This is what printing presses at the time of Tyndale looked like. So you're looking at here some authentic equipment. And knowing how the equipment works is kind of valuable to understanding what the text looks like. For my purposes, I've been looking at three items. One is the 1525 Cologne fragment. So Tyndale actually finished the New Testament in 1525, but it got caught, and most of it got chucked in the River Rhine, and Matthew 1 to 22 got to England. And in 1526, he moved to Worms and completed the New Testament. And then in the meantime, he then produced some items from the Old Testament, and then in 1534 was in Antwerp and did the revised New Testament. So the things I'm going to talk about relate to all of these or one or the other of them. I'm going to talk about features which appear in these. When we were at the museum in Antwerp, it was wonderful for me and many of us that were there to see the actual equipment that Tudor printers used. And here you can actually see how the letters were put into trays, and the printer would select a metal type, put it into another tray, put it together, and then that would be printed on paper. And what was very interesting was to learn that there was two lots of letters, and there was a lowercase, which had the small letters, and there was an uppercase, which had the big letters. And that gives us the terms lowercase and uppercase. So that's amazing to think when we say lowercase and uppercase, we're actually referencing that ancient printing system. And so this is a machine very similar to what would have published Tyndale's New Testament. And what Tyndale did is he was on the continent, and he wasn't using English printers, he was using continental printers. And they printed his New Testament in exactly the same style as they had printed Luther's New Testament. And in fact, any other books they printed were using the same set of letters and sometimes the same woodcuts. And so what we see in the Tyndale New Testament is not necessarily what Tyndale chose, how he chose to present it, because the presentation of his New Testament is very similar to Luther's New Testament. So this was already existing templates that he was using. What was unique to Tyndale was the content, not the layout. So the printers in those days had fonts just as people do now, but not the massive range of fonts that you get if you open Microsoft Word. But today we would call that black letter, or Gothic font, or fractal script. And these were used by the printers in Worms and Antwerp. And when these were designed, they originally mimicked the writing that was done in medieval manuscripts. And so the historic contractions and ligatures, which the monks had used in Latin, became type on the printer, and the printers used the same. And in the Tudor times, the numbers were not the kind of Arabic style numbers which we're used to, but they actually used lowercase Roman numbers. And so the letter sets were also used for numbers. Here's an example of some of the fonts which were in use in those days. And I've just given you some example of some of the letters so you can kind of see how they look. Some of them are pretty obvious, but some of them are a bit confusing. And in these days, the letter I existed, and if you put a tail on the I, it looks like a modern J. But J was not considered a separate letter in those days. I was just a J was just an I with a tail. So when they spelt Jesus, it was actually a capital I. The other thing is that U and V look pretty similar, and they were pretty much used interchangeably. And if you put two U's together, that became a W, and that then became our letter W. But in those days, there was no V and no W in the alphabet. It was just a U. So if we look at the 1525 text, you can see that they use one font for titles and headings, which we call textura, and another font for the main text, which we call bastarda. When we come to the 1526, he's used also two fonts, but he's used the same font for the heading and the text. And then when he comes to the 1534, he uses another font for the comments and the footnotes. Now, when you read this old text, if you get used to it, it's pretty readable, especially if you read it kind of phonetically. But the spelling, some of the words are spelled exactly how we spell words today. But there was no dictionaries in those days, and there was a variety of spelling. So one word might be spelt many different ways. I found the word it spelt 4 different ways with I or Y or single T or double T, but it's clearly it in every case. And so we would spell a word, and then another page it would be spelt differently. And of course, now we look at that and go, it's not consistent. But they didn't have the dictionaries then, and so very much words were spelt how he was used to spelling them, and someone else might spell another word another way. And because there was no J, you get words like rejoice or rejoice with an I. And it's good in a way because it gives us an indication of how words were pronounced. Because a same word might be spelt slightly different in Northern England, and that gives us some indication of how words were pronounced. And the conventions at the time also used contractions and ligatures, which I shall go into. Some of the letters, if you're not used to them, can be quite confusing. So there was actually 3 forms of the letter S. And I've given a little snapshot there from the head of the Gospel of St. John. And you can see there, if you see where it says Sanct John, you've got a capital S there. But in the word gospel, there's what's called the long S, which looks a little bit like an F. But I've took that deliberately because the next word is of with double F, and that's F's. But in gospel, that's an S. And so the F and the S, to our eyes, look quite similar. And the difference was, with an S, the line went up to the stem and didn't go across. But with an F, it went straight across. But I was just listening to somebody talk the other day that was reading an ancient gravestone and said, isn't it interesting that they used F's instead of S's? Well, they didn't. It was a long S, but it just looks like an F to us. So you can see there. Another interesting feature was that at this time, English had a letter which had survived from Anglo-Saxon times called the thorn. But this wasn't used in European type. And so they didn't have a metal type for it at the printers. And so if you look at my illustration here, the thorn to the printer looked a bit like a Y. So they substituted the Y instead. And the thorn was the letter for TH. So thorn, it is called the thorn because it starts with TH. And in fact, if you go to some English tourist towns and you see something, a shop, and over the shop it says ye old shop, it's not actually ye because that letter is actually standing in for TH. So people say it, ye old tea shop, but it's actually the old shop because that was how they represented that letter. We don't do that these days, but that's what's going on. And so you can get an interesting things where that letter, which looks like a Y, was used in ligatures to represent the sound th. So sometimes the word, not always, sometimes the word the had the thorn ligature with an E over it, which looks like ye, but it's not ye, it's the. And that the word that sometimes, but not always, again was represented with a ligature with a Y substituted for thorn with a T over it. And so I've given two examples from Tyndale where you got ye are the light of the world. And I've took that because it starts with ye, which is you, are, and then that Y with the E over it is the. Ye are the light of the world, yeah? And with the that to fulfill that which is spoken. They also did a similar thing with the word with, where a W, they would put a T over it as a contraction for with. And so an example from the text, he that is not with me is against me. Another interesting contraction or ligature, which we still use today, is a symbol for and. So we're probably used to what a lot of people call the ampersand, which is actually a contraction of the Latin et for at et, contracted and written stylistically turned into the ampersand, and that just means and. But actually, that the ampersand is not the symbol that was used in Tyndale's day. It was another symbol that looks like the number 7. And so an example here, you've got arise and take the child and his mother and go into the land of Israel. And so that's using those symbols, which would not be obvious to a lot of people today. Another feature of the texts of Tyndale are contractions caused by a line over a letter or a line through a letter. So very common is a line over an M or an N, which effectively says this letter is doubled. So quite common in the text is commanded with M with a line over, and we would spell that with double N now. And another example is cannot, which we would spell with a double N, and is an M with a line over. But sometimes it is double M and sometimes it is double N. So this wasn't done consistently. And I think one of the things was when you're setting a line, and you don't want a line to go over to the next line. So to bunch up the letters, you might then put a line over one letter to save space. A similar thing happens with the vowels. In Tyndale's day, if you put a vowel, a letter or a macron over a vowel, it indicated that there was an N, usually, or sometimes an M following it. So, for example, the word and, if they weren't using that symbol that looked like a 7, it's sometimes spelt with an A and a line over it, followed by a D. But FRO with a line over it, well, there's no such word as from, so that is from. And so you kind of know from the context whether it's an N or an M. Those are very common, but there's also a couple of other symbols which are less common, but are found particularly in the 1534 New Testament. If you see a D with a line through the D, that stands for der. So, for example, in the text you have understand, and the D is just a D with a line through. And another one is the letter P, and if the letter P has a little squiggle on the tail, that is short for either per or pro. And so sometimes you have the word prophet spelled P with a line over instead of the RO. And another one is a V. If there's a V with a line through it, that's actually short for VER. And if you look at these are all, the ER is kind of what is contracted after each one. And so you get whosoever, but in the text it just says whosoever with a line through the V. And so that line through means kind of stick an ER on the end. So you can see there. So but in profit it's PRO, but it can also be used. So it's also used in the word pertaining, where they use P for pertaining there. So those are the common contractions. There's one other contraction I found, but only found once, so I've not mentioned to bother that. But these are all fairly common. Another confusion for people, particularly if you've not done Shakespeare or you've not grown up on the King James Version, is that there's 3 different forms of you. In English today, there's one form of you, although if you live in Texas, you might say you all, and if you live in Ulster, you might say yous. So there is kind of 2 forms of you, depending on where you live. But anyway, in Tyndale's day, there were 3 forms of you. And on the left-hand side, I've called them the second person singular informal, second person singular formal, and the second person plural. And I've put examples of how you get similar things in other languages. So I used to live in Germany, and in Germany, you can say du if you know the person well, sie if they're your boss or you don't know them well, or ihr if there's a lot of people. And they say, or duzen and sitzen. And in French, you have tu vous, and in Spanish, you have tu usted and vosotros. So this phenomena appears in other European languages. It's just been largely lost in English. So in Tyndale's day, you was thou. So I've taken some examples from the Bible. Thou art one of them. And thee was the accusative or object. So I say unto thee. You wouldn't say I say unto thou. That makes no sense. I say unto thee. And then the possessive is thy or thine if it's before a vowel. So this is thy son, but this is thine eye. And then Tyndale does use the word you in its kind of polite form. So John the Baptist says to Jesus, I baptize you in water. So that's interesting, isn't it? He doesn't say I baptize thee in water, I baptize you in water. And so when they translate the Greek, you know, if you've got different forms of you, you've got to decide which one is the most appropriate. And the possessive or the genitive form is your, let your light shine, just as today. But there's also a plural form, which is ye. And it's still sometimes people today still say ye a little bit, don't they? But we very well know the phrase, don't we? Seek ye first the kingdom of God. That's plural. And sometimes you'll get a phrase with you and ye in. So I found this one here. For if ye love them which love you, what reward shall ye have? So there is if ye love them, that's all of you love them, which love you, which is you in particular, what reward shall ye have, all of you? So you can have a sentence with different forms of you in together. It's slightly more complicated because sometimes at this time, you and ye were kind of merging. But that's the kind of way it's supposed to work anyway.
Mm.
Then you've got archaic inflections, which we don't have in modern English. And when you have a verb, which is in the second person singular present, you put est on the end. So the example, I've taken the verb so, because I found all these forms in the New Testament. So you can say thou sowest, but we'd just say you sow, wouldn't we? And in the past, thou sowedest, but now we just say you sowed. So we've lost that est ending in modern English.
Mm.
But in the third person singular, it would be eth. So for example, she or he soweth. And that's the eth in modern English has been changed to an s. So now we'd say she sows, she soweth, she sows. So we've still got an inflection on the third person singular in English. Now, when it comes to punctuation, it was partly the same as we use today, but not completely. So the full stops are the same, the question marks are the same, and the explanation marks are the same. But when he started paragraphs, he used a symbol which is like a big flipped C with 2 lines through it. It looks like a bit like someone's currency symbol in some country, doesn't it, really? It's called the capitulum, and that was used to mark a new paragraph. Now, these days, we just indent the text for a new paragraph. And later, this became what's called the pilcrow, which you might see in some old Bibles. But instead of the comma, they used what you might call a slash or a line. So if you have a look at this text, you can see some of these. Can you see kind of diagonal lines? And those would be commas today.
Hmm.
Sometimes when you get to the end of a line, I don't know if you can see down a couple of lines down, there's a word which goes over and to the next line, and then they put like what we might call an equal sign, which is like an end of line hyphen. And so that takes it over there.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's a prologue. The prologues weren't introduced until the 1534 edition, but it's a rather nice example there. And often they would start a new book with two big letters, and sometimes they would put an interesting woodcut in, so it's quite pleasant. The other thing to know is saint. Oh, these days, when if you say saint, like St. Paul's or St. John's, you put ST. But in these days, it's just an S. So St. Paul is just S. And so are the four evangelists, St. Matthew, St. Mark, St. Luke, St. John, are just with an S. Now, when it comes to speech, the modern practice of speech marks for speech was not used in these days. There is no speech marks. So I've picked a piece of text here with a lot of speech in. The woman said unto him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Okay. So what they do is they've just put a colon in and then the next word starts with a capital letter. Now, these days we'd put speech marks in there, but this is the same as the King James version of the Bible. And in fact, speech marks didn't come into English Bibles until pretty recently. I looked through my old Bibles and I've got a Moffat 1934 New Testament with speech marks in, which is the oldest one I could find. And the most, in terms of very commonly used ones, the Revised Standard Version, New Testament, 1946, was the first major translation to have speech marks in speech. So if you imagine that really for 450 years, this is how we read speech in Bibles.
Hmm.
Now, when it comes to numbers, they didn't use the numbers like we do. The numbers were Roman letters, but they were normally lowercase Roman letters. And so an I was one, but if you had a string of I's, the last one they put a tail on, so it looks like a J. So for example, 13 would be lowercase x, I, J, but it's really just a tail on the last I. V was used for 5. Sometimes they used a capital letter and sometimes a lowercase letter, and sometimes they mixed them up. Before I came here, I was just checking about feeding of the 5,000 in one of the Gospels, and he's got a lowercase v followed by a capital M for 5,000. But in one of the other Gospels, he's written 5,000 in words. So there was an inconsistency between using letters for numbers and words. And that might have been also to do with saving space. I don't know. But, they didn't have modern software that checks all your consistency for you. So it didn't really matter. People were delighted to get the Bible and didn't really worry about all the inconsistencies. So you had X for 10, L for 50, C for 100. And I was thinking we still kind of use C for 100. If you think of the word centimetre, it's a hundredth of a metre, don't we? D for 50, M for 1,000. And so in the 1526 New Testament, he's got M, D, X, X, V, I, all in capitals. But in the 1534 at the front, it's got MD, and then he's got the and symbol, and then he's got 34 in lowercase, which is in that illustration there. So they sometimes even mix uppercase and lowercase for the numbers. And that even comes in the names of books. So I've got an example here. Third Epistle of John is IIJ. And from his Pentateuch, is an interesting one I found. Noah was 600-year old, and the 6 is VI, and 100 is written in words. Now, when to stop you confusing letters and numbers, when it was within the text, they'd put a dot before and after the lowercase characters, because otherwise Noah was Vi, okay? And I know he was Noah, not Vi, but if you put a dot before the V and the I, it becomes 6, yeah? So that's what they used to do. Their capitalization was very similar to today. So they capitalized proper names, capitalized at the beginning of sentences, and capitalized the start of speech. And when it was the start of a new chapter, they capitalized, the first letter was really big, and then they capitalized the second letter as well, and sometimes put in a woodcut as well. But it was sometimes a bit inconsistent. So sometimes you might get God with a capital G and God with a lowercase g. And we know from context what he means. But these days, God with a lower g is referred to, it's when we mean like a pagan deity like Woden or Zeus. That's a god, isn't it? As opposed to God with a capital G. And so it's not always done because Paul sometimes has a capital P and sometimes a lowercase p. You know from context. But these days you would tidy that up. But you can see in this example here, Theophilus has got a T there because it's the beginning of Luke. When he came to the 1534 New Testament, Tyndale introduced a lot of new features, which I'm going to talk about. And these features do not apply to the 1526. In this example on the front plate, you can see there the capitulum, can't you? The, and then you, you've got a double, like an equal sign to say this goes over the line. Testament, comma, gently corrected and compared with the Greek by William Tyndale and finished in the year of our Lord God. And then you can see the numbers. The A in front of the MD there is anno, meaning year, MD for 15 and 34 in the month of November. So you can see in November, the U is we'd put a V in there, but it's a U there. And so with a bit of training, you can read these. Now, in the 1534, Tyndale paragraphed the text. So he indented the text. And at the head of many of the paragraphs, not all, but most of them, he would put a little summary in the left, which is a bit like a heading. These days, that would be a subheading in the text. And so here he's talking about Jesus' baptism and he's put Christ is baptized. And then he's got the genealogy and he writes genealogy. So today that would be a subheading. When you have the Bible, you've got the left-hand side and the right-hand side, which are called uh, verso and recto, and it's always on the outer edge, not on the inner edge. And so the binding is down the middle, and these are always on the outer edge. He also puts in cross references. And so I've got an example here with a load of cross references. And so he's got a paragraph there. Covenant there is like the subheading for it. And then he's got a lot of cross references. But he doesn't, modern Bibles often have a little letter or number, don't they, next to the word to say the cross reference goes with this word. And he occasionally does that, but he doesn't normally. You just got to work it out. So there isn't always a caller to the cross reference. And these days, a cross references would probably be in the center gutter or as a footnote, but he's got them down the side. And the cross references are very helpful. And I've looked them up and they're very good and they're very similar to modern Bibles. But what he does is he abbreviates the book just as we might today. And so MAR is Mark and IO, capital IO is John, and JACO or capital ACO is Jacko, which is James. And then he puts the chapter number in, but of course it's lowercase Roman, isn't it? And what's interesting to know is that there were no verse numbers in any of Tyndale's New Testaments because verse numbers were not introduced until the Geneva Bible. So the chapter numbers is the same as our chapter numbers, but there's no verse numbers. And in fact, there's no referencing for verses at all in the 1526 because there's no cross references and there's no comments in that. But when it comes to 1534, each paragraph he puts a letter by it. So A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. And so parts of the chapters are lettered, like a pericope. And so when he's got a cross-reference here, so if you look at the top one in my example, you've got Matthew 7, and I think that's A. So that would be the start of Matthew 7. So that's what they did. And then the verse numbers actually didn't come in until Geneva.
Mm.
So it's helpful and you can use it. Because sometimes he might reference a book that he hasn't translated yet as well. So that's quite interesting. He also puts in comments. In the fifth, he had some comments. In the 1525 Cologne fragment, there are a lot of comments. And so that 1525 New Testament, and I hope one day someone might find one, it's tantalizing to think that would have had a lot of comments in. But then in 1526, I think to get it out quicker, he just cut them out. And then 1534, he's put them back in or put in the different ones. And so you get comments in the outer margin. And what's interesting, can you see it's a slightly different font? So the main text is what we might call a black letter or Gothic font, but the comments are actually in a more like a modern font, aren't they? And he puts put a caller in. So if you have a look at this text and you look on the third line, there's an asterisk before Moses. You see Moses there? M-O long S, E short S. And then there's an asterisk and then Moses, and then he writes a bit about Moses. And so this is talking about Moses' seat. And Tyndale says, I don't agree with him, but he says, Moses' seat is Moses' doctrine as Christ's seat is Christ's doctrine. So that's what he thinks a Moses' seat means. I remember being in the Holy Land and going to take him to an old synagogue. And at the front, there was a chair at the front. And they told me that that's called Moses' seat. So he probably wouldn't know that. And that might be what it means. But maybe Tyndale's right and I'm wrong. I don't mind. So he would use a caller, often an asterisk. In the 1525 Cologne fragment, he uses a little pointy hand, which is quite fun. But in the 1534, he's gone to use an asterisk as well. So these days, we'd call them footnotes, but these are margin notes. And so you find these comments in the Cologne fragment 1525, dropped in the 1526, and reintroduced in 1534.
Mm. Mm.
The other interesting thing in the 1534 was at the back of the New Testament, he put an appendix of lectionary readings to the Old Testament. So in the New Testament, he's got a table of New Testament readings, but in the back, because he hasn't done the Old Testament yet, he actually just puts those verses in as an appendix. And so if you see, this is the table wherein you shall find the epistles and the gospels after the use of Salisbury. Now, Salisbury, right, was the lectionary system which was then adopted by the Church of England, which is actually underpins the Revised Common Lectionary. And so the lectionary that he used is still very similar to the one today, except now it's over 3 years instead of one.
Mm.
And in it, he explains, I don't know if you can see this, for to find them, the sooner, so shall you seek after the capital letters by name, A, B, C, D. So that's the pericopes that he's labeling, which stand by the side of this book, always or under the letter. There shall you find a cross where the epistle or the gospel beginneth, and where the end is, there you shall find a half cross. So I've put this on the right hand side, that the pericopes which were in the lectionary, there was a little full cross to say this starts and a half cross to say it finishes. And so you could use his Bible like your lectionary book, because you went to church on Sunday and you could find the relevant reading. Now, I'm not 100% sure, but my theory is that he was attending the English church in Antwerp, where the pastor or the vicar, the priest, was John Rogers. And John Rogers might have said to him, please, can you translate the lectionary readings for us so we can use them at church? And so that might be the origin of this. Mm. What's very interesting is that he did translate some of the Old Testament, and we've got his Pentateuch and his Jonah. And we think he did up to 2 Chronicles. But in the lectionary readings, we've actually got selections from across the Old Testament, including a couple of verses from the Apocrypha. So maybe gives an inkling of what he would have finished if he hadn't been executed. So what I've done here is I've just taken the beginning of John and I've typed it up in like an old English font. And have a go and see if you can read that.
In the beginning was that word, and that word was with God, and God was.
In it was life, and life was the light of men, and the light shineth in darkness, and darkness comprehend.
It's simple.
Yeah. So now you know the rules. Now you know that the slash is a comma and that the line over the vowel, you stick an N next to it. And you know that they used to swap I's and Y's and stick E's where you didn't really need them. When you know all that, you can read it. And not only can you read it, you can understand that perfectly, can't you? And isn't it amazing? This was 500 years ago, and we can still read that and understand every single word of that now. Now, there is the odd word in Tyndale we don't use today, but by and large, you can understand it all. I find that incredible. Now, what I've done here is I've taken the panel at the front of Tyndale's 1526 New Testament. And I, like some of us, I was in Antwerp at the conference, and I had the enormous privilege of seeing the actual original, only pristine copy of the 1526 New Testament, which we had borrowed from Stuttgart. This is the photograph of it. And so that's the panel there. And you look at that and you think, whoa. So what I've done is I've transcribed it in original spelling. Then I've uncontracted it. So where you have a line over a letter, I've filled it out and put in modern punctuation. And then I've modernized it. And so what that says is, the New Testament, as it was written and caused to be written by them which heard it, to whom also our Saviour Christ Jesus commanded that they should preach it unto all creatures. And so with a little bit of work, you can read original Tyndale. I think that's amazing. I'm just going to finish now with one little section. And I want to see, I don't know if someone wants to volunteer to try and read this. Would someone like to volunteer? And then you see if you can work out what it is.
John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he has given his only Son, that none that believe in him should perish, but should have everlasting life. And so it goes on.
Fantastic. So now you can read that, can't you? And what I've done is I typed that out and just modernized the contractions and modernized the inflections. For God so loves the world that he's given his only Son, that none that believe in him should perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. But he that believes not is condemned already, because he believes not in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the condemnation: the light is come into the world, and the men love darkness more than the light, because their deeds were evil. For every man that evil doeth hates the light, neither comes to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. But he that does truth comes to the light, that his deeds might be known, how that they are wrought in God. Now, I don't know about you, I think that is pretty perfectly understandable. Modern Bibles would tend to say actions instead of deeds, but we still use the word deeds. There's nothing wrong with that. And so you can now read Tyndale. Thank you very much. So my email is there if you want it. But what I'm going to do now, I could do with a little breather. So if Marilyn does a little chat, and then I'll be open to questions. I'm a linguist, but you asked me to give a presentation, so I just knocked it out the other day. But it's based upon what I worked out from going through the text. So I'm going to share screen again. And then if you just confirm you're seeing a different web page, then I'll talk you through it.
Yep. Yes.
Okay, so I've set up a web page. It's online now. Any of you can access it. It's tyndale.global.bible. And on there, I'm trying to build up a catalogue of Tyndale's work that are available for people. And in each item, the aim, we're not quite there yet, but the aim is to have a version as close to the original as possible, bearing in mind modern fonts. And so if you look here at the example of the Cologne fragment, using Unicode and modern fonts, I've tried to replicate what it looked like. So if you look at the first line there, I've got a line over the N for sun, and I've got a capitulum there, okay? And so that's that one. And then here, if you click on this symbol here, it should enable you to do two side by side. So what this will enable you to do is put the original next to the modern spelling.
Yeah.
And then if you go chapter 2, they go in sync. And so what I've done is I've missed out the intermediary stage because I don't see much point in that. You either want to look at the original or you want it modernized. I don't think there's not much point in having it in the middle. And so my plan is that we will have everything that Tyndale did in his lifetime in original form and modernized form.